Last month, President Biden warned that the world's at risk of a nuclear Armageddon due to the ongoing conflict that Russia started with its invasion of Ukraine. Although U.S. security officials insist that they have no evidence to suggest that Vladimir Putin is planning on using nuclear weapons anytime soon, the Russian president's rhetoric is quite alarming. Vladimir Putin has said that he's willing to use tactical nukes should it come to that. Now, I know that politicians, both foreign and domestic, aren't above hyperbole or bombastic rhetoric when they think it suits their purposes. But it's alarming that a world leader thinks it's to his best advantage to even talk like this. Perhaps Joe Biden was right when he said that we're the closest we've come to a nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the details about the Cuban Missile Crisis that I've always found most interesting is that President Kennedy had a particular book in mind that helped him navigate the situation and avoid nuclear war. As the National Endowment for the Humanities writes, the evening of October 26th, the president fell into a conversation with his brother Robert, Kenny O'Donnell, and Ted Sorensen about World War I. A few months earlier, President Kennedy had read Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August, which detailed the miscalculations and misunderstandings that led to the war. Kennedy told his cohorts, "I am not going to follow a course which will allow anyone to write a comparable book about this time, The Missiles of October. If anybody is around to write after this, they're going to understand that we made every effort to find peace and every effort to give our adversary room to move." From Tuchman's book, Kennedy gleaned that giving both yourself and your opponent options could prevent a crisis from escalating into all-out war. The president would ultimately offer the Soviets a deal to end the crisis. In exchange for the Soviet Union not putting missiles in Cuba, the United States would remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. When I learned about how this book helped alter human history by helping us avoid nuclear war, I knew that I had to read it. When I did, my first takeaway was how unrecognizable the continent of Europe is. The Guns of August described the events that took place in the very first month of World War I, August 1914, almost 110 years ago. This is a blink of an eye in human history. One of the biggest differences between then and now is how much national pride and self-confidence the French had. They anticipated that a war with Germany was coming, and they knew they were both outmanned and outgunned. But they firmly believed that their national character would help them carry the day. As Barbara Tuchman wrote in The Guns of August,
"Living in the shadow of that unfinished business, France, reviving in spirit and strength, grew weary of being eternally on guard, eternally exhorted by her leaders to defend herself. As the century turned, her spirit rebelled against 30 years of the defensive, with its implied avowal of inferiority. France knew herself to be physically weaker than Germany. Her population was less, her birth rate lower. She needed some weapon that Germany lacked to give herself confidence in her survival. The idea with a sword fulfilled the need. Expressed by Bergson, it was called Élan Vital, the all-conquering will. Belief in its power convinced France that the human spirit need not, after all, bow to the predestined forces of evolution, which Schopenhauer and Hegel had declared to be irresistible. The spirit of France would be the equalizing factor. Her will to win, her élan, would enable France to defeat her enemy.
That certainly doesn't sound like the French we know today, much less the French that fought the Germans in World War II. Friend of the channel, Actual Justice Warrior, has a video on the topic of moral paralysis and how it affects a country's national character.
Now, the idea of moral paralysis is not something that we should think about in the abstract sense. It's not something that is for academics, that has no real-world implications. It has had impact on world events. And I'm going to give you a perfect example in the nation of France, their World War II performance versus their World War I performance. In World War I, the French resisted German occupation and invasion for 4 strong years. They lost more people in that war than Americans have died in all of our wars combined in the history of this country, but they held the line and they fought bravely. They won many victories. They glorified the French after they won these victories because they understood that fundamentally allowing the Germans to run roughshod over their civilization was not moral. They believed France was worth fighting for, which is why they fought so hard. But in World War II, and for all the years after, the French gained a reputation for surrender. And that's because in World War II, they surrendered in 6 weeks. How did this happen? How did a once mighty people just a generation before, known for resistance, fighting tooth and nail to the last man, not wanting to be ruled by anybody, let alone their German neighbors, within a generation become cowards, become a punchline, surrender to the Nazi government in 6 weeks? What went wrong here? And fundamentally, it was because the French became war weary. It's because the French didn't think France was worth defending. They thought that the illusion of peace was more palatable than actually facing the war. They thought they could pacify the warlike intentions by downplaying the heroism of the French in the previous generation. Teachers who were obsessed with peace demanded that the textbooks that kids were getting remove all mention of the French soldiers as heroes. Instead, they were portrayed as victims, or if there was any talk of heroism, it was talking about heroism on both sides, the World War I Germans and the heroes on the side of the French. It was never something where the French were asserting that they were a morally superior force to the Germanic peoples. They just gave up. They surrendered. They surrendered in their minds before they surrendered on the battlefield.
This goes a long way in explaining what changed for the French between the two world wars. Those of you who watch this channel know that I'm not the biggest fan of Vladimir Putin and his regime. We've seen massive protests in Russia in response to the regime's invasion and the partial mobilization that was enacted months later, which is, of course, encouraging. Unfortunately, a lot of Russians, probably most in fact, are supportive of Putin's revanchist belligerence. Public opinion is always hard to gauge, even more so in authoritarian states than democracies, so we can't say that for sure, but there are good reasons to believe that's the case. I've talked before on this channel about how geography plays a big role in informing this Russian sense of insecurity, and that this insecurity has translated to offensive conquests, shoring up Russia's insecure borders, and that this strategy has been employed by Russian leadership since Russia has existed as a country. Some people might find that depressing, and think that I'm suggesting that this is some fixed quality of Russia as a nation. After all, the geological timescale is typically measured in millions of years. Practically speaking, it's an immutable characteristic for politics. After all, Russia's geography isn't changing anytime soon. If this mindset is the result of geography, then presumably there's no escaping it, right? But while geography may more or less be fixed, national mindset isn't. Geography matters, but it's not destiny. And while we've seen national mindsets change for the worse in the case of the French, World War I provides another example of a national mindset ultimately changing for the better. France isn't the only nation that's unrecognizable in the lead up to World War I. Germany, too, will be completely unfamiliar to modern readers. Several months ago, our boy from the channel Secular Talk released a video about Taiwan where he made a very silly comparison to World War I.
If you have these treaties where independent nations are tied into the future of other nations, and so in other words, if country X is drawn into a war, then country Y has an obligation because of a treaty to also jump into that war on that side. But then country C hops in and country L has to hop in on the side of country C. And so what happens is if you have all these mutual defense treaties, well, if people actually abide by them, it doesn't take long for the entire world to be at war. So you get random Archduke Ferdinand gets assassinated in, I think, Austria-Hungary, and the next thing you know, the entire world is at war. That's World War II. That's World War I. Why? Why did that happen? Because everybody had these strategic alliances where, hey, if I go to war, you go to war with me, right? Okay, right. And if they go to war with them. And everybody abided by the treaties, and so the entire world was at war.
The error here isn't just that Franz Ferdinand wasn't just some random archduke. He was the heir to Austria-Hungary, one of the main countries in the conflict. No, the more consequential error that Mr. Kalinsky makes is the idea that the nations of Europe just made these alliances apropos of nothing. Prior to the First World War, the powers of Europe had been anticipating and planning for war. The martial nature of Germany was in no small part a contributing factor to this. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Germany had been suffering from a sense of insecurity. The mentality was that, unlike its older European neighbors, it wasn't being treated with the respect the German people thought it was due. Kaiser Wilhelm, the Emperor of Germany, was particularly bitter. As Tuchman wrote,
Envy of the older nations gnawed at him. He complained to Theodore Roosevelt that the English nobility on continental tours never visited Berlin, but always went to Paris. He felt unappreciated. All the long years of my reign, he told the King of Italy, my colleagues, the monarchs of Europe, have paid no attention to what I have to say. Soon, with my great navy to endorse my words, they will be more respectful. The same sentiments ran through his whole nation, which suffered like their emperor from a terrible need for recognition. Pulsing with energy and ambition, conscious of strength, fed upon Nietzsche and Treitschke, they felt entitled to rule, and cheated that the world did not acknowledge their title. "We must," wrote Friedrich von Bernhardi, the spokesman of militarism, "secure to German nationality and German spirit throughout the globe that high esteem which is due them, and has hitherto been withheld from them." He frankly allowed only one method of attaining the goal.
The insecurity wasn't merely limited to mere slights, though. Napoleon Bonaparte is supposed to have said that Prussia was hatched from a cannonball, meaning that militarism seemed to be part of German DNA as a nation. In 1910, German General Adam Julius von Bernhardi wrote a best-selling book which seemed to capture this militaristic spirit. The next war had chapters with names like The Right to Make War, The Duty to Make War, and World Power or Downfall. I have not read the book myself, but Tuchman summarized the primary thesis.
War, he stated, is a biological necessity. It is the carrying out among humankind of the natural law upon which all the laws of nature rest, the law of the struggle for existence. Nations, he said, must progress or decay. There can be no standing still, and Germany must choose world power or downfall. Among the nations, Germany is in social, political respects at the head of all progress in culture, but is compressed into narrow, unnatural limits. She cannot attain her great moral ends without increased political power, an enlarged sphere of influence, and new territory. This increase in power, befitting our importance and which we are entitled to claim, is a political necessity and the first and foremost duty of the state. In his own italics, Bernhardi announced, "What we now wish to attain must be fought for." And from here he galloped home to the finish line. Conquest thus becomes a law of necessity.
What caught my attention most was the lines about Germany being compressed into narrow, unnatural limits. The limits may be institutional, but this is likely a reference to geography as well. Germany, since its creation, has primarily been a land power. This necessarily means that it is vulnerable. As Robert Kaplan writes in The Revenge of Geography, land powers are perennially insecure. As Maham intimated, without seas to protect them, they are forever dissatisfied and have to keep expanding or be conquered in turn themselves. Geography is often overlooked in contemporary politics, as institutions are generally seen as more impactful. The contention of geopolitical analysts like Robert Kaplan is not that geography explains everything, or that it should be focused on at the exclusion of all other factors when explaining human behavior, but that it can't be ignored because it still matters. I would argue that indeed it does matter, especially in how it helps shape human institutions. For Germany of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it would appear as though geography played a role in shaping the martial attitude of conquer or be conquered. The martial spirit of Germany was not lost on other European powers, including King Edward VII of England and George Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, whose nickname was the Tiger of France.
The Tiger shared Napoleon's opinion that Prussia was hatched from a cannonball and saw the cannonball coming in his direction. He worked, he planned, he maneuvered in the shadow of one dominant idea. The German lust for power has fixed as its policy the extermination of France. He told Edward that when the time came when France needed help, England's sea power would not be enough, and reminded him that Napoleon was beaten at Waterloo, not Trafalgar.
Edward VII was particularly bullish on seeking alliances. He forged them with France and Russia, and even sought to peel Italy away from its alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Most of this happened after he tried to reach out to Germany in 1899 and 1901. In hopes of cooling tensions, only to be rebuffed by Kaiser Wilhelm. Wilhelm seemed to have a very paranoid streak within him, as he was convinced that King Edward, his own uncle, had some nefarious agenda behind these diplomatic overtures. Wilhelm reviled King Edward, who he believed was plotting Germany's downfall through its system of alliances. The Kaiser cried encirclement in the face of Britain's new alliances, and breathed a sigh of relief when his dear uncle, who he called the Encircler, died in 1910. That this encirclement was in no small part a response to Wilhelm's belligerent rhetoric never seemed to occur to the Kaiser. I couldn't help but think of Vladimir Putin and his talk of NATO encirclement when I first read this. Of course, we know this all ended with the bloodiest war the world had ever seen, and after that, Germany changed, and not for the better. If you don't believe that a country can change quickly, Just read some history of the 20th century. It will remind you that change can come quick and that it isn't an inherently good thing. After World War II, Germany was partitioned for nearly 4 decades. After they lost the Second World War, the Germans actually dealt with their history in a constructive way. Modern Germany is definitely not a perfect country. They've arguably achieved their goal of taking over the continent, just economically through the EU. Those who know better than I do can surely point out some of the hazards of this. That said, this is infinitely preferable to a Germany that tries to take over the continent militarily. In fact, I would argue that the German people are far too adverse to conflict at this point, which has made them too conciliatory to Russian interests in particular. That is, until relatively recently. They perhaps have gone too far with their whole war guilt. As James Kirkchick writes in The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, a laudable effort to atone for the nation's historic crimes and a heightened sensitivity to how it is perceived abroad have instilled cautiousness and deference in German foreign policy. For instance, when German President Horst Kohler paid a visit to German troops stationed in Afghanistan, and remarked that military deployments are necessary in an emergency to protect our interests. For example, when it comes to preventing regional instabilities that could negatively affect our trade, jobs, and incomes. The criticism from the German public was so overwhelmingly negative that he resigned in shame. That a German political leader, however clumsily and thoughtlessly, would describe a negative impact on trade, jobs, and incomes as an emergency, justifying foreign military intervention summoned disturbing memories of Lebensraum, literally living space, a term Hitler used to justify Nazi Germany's eastward expansion and the extraction of gold-capped teeth from concentration camp prisoners. German leaders are careful to present themselves as the ultimate team players and their foreign policy as exceptionally selfless. The foreign ministry still likes talking about responsibilities rather than interests, observes Friedbert Plüger, a former foreign policy spokesman for Merkel's center-right Christian Democratic Union. In the media, politics, and the think tank community, the strategic class consists of just a few individuals. The very word strategy conjures fearsome images of war rooms and pieces on a global chessboard. Most foreign policy conversations in Berlin lean into soft subjects like human rights and development. This is a far cry from General Bernardi. Since World War II, Germany's borders have shifted, but it's still fundamentally a land power. And yet, the insecurity-driven conquest is completely gone from its people. If anything, the exact opposite is true. Germany, like France, very much suffers from moral paralysis. Again, this has become a problem in its own right. But I find it encouraging overall when thinking about Russia. As the Germans have demonstrated, geography is not destiny. Russia's consistent history of expansive wars ultimately has its roots in geography. It doesn't need to be this way, though. How does Russia change? I don't know. I just hope it doesn't come to nuclear war.